So, as I said, we're in for a big treat today, and it's really my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Vijay Mittal from Northwestern. And his talk today is Motor Signs Can Help to Answer Pressing Issues in the Understanding and Treatment of Serious Mental Illness, Insights from Psychosis-Risk Research. And I wanted to start today by saying a few words about Vijay. So he is the David S. Holmes Professor of Brain Science and the Chair of Psychology at Northwestern University. He also holds an appointment in psychiatry and is also involved with a number of other centers and institutes at Northwestern. He received his undergraduate degree from UC Santa Barbara and his PhD from Emory University, where he worked with Elaine Walker, who some of you may remember was a grand round speaker last year on genetics of schizophrenia. After graduate school, Vijay completed his internship at UCLA with a focus on adolescent serious mental illness, and then did a postdoctoral fellowship in schizophrenia research also at UCLA. He then became a faculty member at University of Colorado at Boulder, and after a few years went to Northwestern. Vijay is one of the most productive schizophrenia researchers working today. He has made important contributions to several areas. I would say it's probably fair to say that he's most known for his work on risk for developing a psychotic disorder, but he does not only work in that area. At Northwestern, he's founded the ADAPT Research Lab, which focuses on adolescents and young adults at risk for serious mental illness. He has over 300 publications, and the number is increasing, I think, exponentially every year. And he's the PI on a large multi-center grant, computerized assessment of psychosis risk that I've been involved with. And he is also now and has been site PI or co-investigator on a number of other grants funded by NIH or various foundations. So he's gotten quite a bit of funding, and he's very productive publishing on his work. He's also received a number of impressive awards. I'll just mention a few of them here. One is the NIMH Brains Award, and that's all capitalized, brains. The Society for Research in Psychopathology Early Career Award, the Federation for Brain and Behavioral Sciences Early Career Award, and the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation Independent Investigator Award. Vijay is currently an associate editor for the Journal of Psychopathology and Clinical Science, which for about 120 years was the Journal of Abnormal Psychology, and that's its new name, and also for Schizophrenia Bulletin. So these are two of the top journals in essentially clinical psychology and psychiatry. He's also a member of the NIMH study section, Adult Psychopathology and Disorders of Aging, or actually now ALP, and is currently the president of the Society for Research in Psychopathology, where he also was on the executive board previously. In short, Vijay, I'll just say colloquially, he's a very impressive guy, and I've enjoyed working with him on a number of projects over the years. He's a highly respected expert and thought leader in the areas of neurodevelopment and psychotic disorders, and his work on motor signs in people at risk for schizophrenia is creative and important. As you'll see, it also has the potential really to be translated into real-world applications. So having said all that, I'm going to stop now and let Vijay give his presentation. So welcome, Vijay, and let's all here give him a nice welcome.
I want to thank Steve for the warm introduction. It was a little embarrassing, but it's a real pleasure to speak to you all today. And I'll just say Steve is also one of the most brilliant collaborators I work with, and it's a real pleasure. And he's a testament to your training and your program. Today I'm going to talk to you about motor signs, and I'm going to scaffold all of this in the psychosis risk population that I do a lot of my work in. But the real take-home message is there are some issues that we're dealing with when trying to understand, treat, and predict serious mental illness. And I think that a broader incorporation of motor signs can make a big difference here. So I'm going to go through a few examples today, as many as I can get through, and that leads to my next point. I typically speak over, but I want to leave time for questions today. So I'm going to thank people up front. Thanks to my lab and family and funding, I couldn't do any of this without them. So why motor signs? We didn't evolve to think and then learn to move. We evolved to move, and movement helped to build the brain that thinks. Moving and thinking are intimately intertwined, and for most of our history, our survival has depended on a fidelity of movement, on whether the brain's prediction of the body matched the body's reality. Understanding the gap between expectation and execution and interrogating when motor function works and when it can go wrong can provide a window into fundamental processes. Motor behavior is an outward manifestation of internal processes that are of great risk to understanding serious mental illness. It's also well characterized by the field of neurology. We have a much better grounding on the neurological basis of motor behavior than we do on many other functions of interest in psychiatry. And that way, we have a bedrock and a foundation to venture out and do more exploratory work. It's readily observable and detectable. That will be a theme that comes up a lot today. And it has a multi-directional influence. As I mentioned in my introduction, the brain and the body are intertwined and influence one another constantly. And so that gives wonderful opportunities for understanding dynamic mechanisms and also for intervention. One of the first issues that I come up against a lot is that contending with human development is tricky. We're still in the process as a broader field of understanding human development, especially at early stages. And understanding where it goes wrong is an added complexity on that. There are a number of issues around assessment that are particularly thorny that get in the way of progress. One is that an assessment for looking at a particular function in a 15-year-old might not be appropriate for an 11-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 1-year-old. And NIH is working to combat this, but it's slow going because there's so many developmental differences at every level. But motor behaviors offer a real tool here because they're so easy to assess for us to get at underlying mechanisms. And I'm going to give you an example now. This also is a brief introduction to the psychosis-risk period. I understand that many of you are probably already aware of it, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But schizophrenia is a neurodevelopmental disorder, and we're all familiar with the syndrome after onset. It's characterized by positive symptoms, negative symptoms, cognitive symptoms. It's prominent things like delusions, hallucinations, and really, there's a lot that's going on before that. From birth to about the beginning of adolescence, we have what we call a premorbid period. And this has been characterized by really broad deficits that are indicative that there's a vulnerability there, but not necessarily predictive of later onset. And some of these deficits might remediate, some of them might presage other types of disorders. But some of them, definitely happen in people that eventually develop schizophrenia. It's not really to the onset of adolescence, though, that we start to see more specificity. We start to see particular behaviors, but also the emergence of subtle attenuated symptoms. And when these come about and start to impact functioning, we consider this a risk sign. And a lot of the work I do follows teenagers that are meeting criteria for a risk syndrome called the clinical high risk syndrome. And anywhere from 10 to 30% of these youth will go on to develop a disorder like schizophrenia in a 2-year period. The mean age of onset of schizophrenia is in the early 20s. And so we think something is going on in adolescence that's unmasking that early vulnerability where we saw signs in the premorbid period. It could be normative human development interacting with that vulnerability. It could be abnormal development or some confluence of the two. It could be environmental stressors, and these are all likely targets, and it's likely a complex series of contributors that are involved. But once we start to see the unusual thoughts and suspiciousness and grandiosity, disorganized communication, we see it in a subsample of people get worse over time relatively quickly. And it starts to really impair them, happen more frequently, cause more distress. And after it hits a certain point where it's happening for hours every day and leading to a lot of disability, we consider that the onset of a psychotic disorder. And so a lot of the work I'm going to be talking about today is in this adolescent period where we're contending with normative and pathological development, as well as emerging psychosis, as well as teenagers. And so it's a complex picture. And this is another reason why I think motor signs are particularly helpful. One of the things that got me into this area to begin with is the motor signs really track that same figure I just showed you in terms of neurodevelopmental sequence. In the premorbid period, there are clear and distinctive motor abnormalities. And we see this in the form of delays, developmental delays in walking and talking, potty training. But we also see some unusual movements. In childhood, the signs are still there, but they become less pronounced. In Walker's study, she stopped to detect significant effects. We still saw examples, but they were no longer differentiating the um, uh, group that one day developed the disorder from controls. And one of the reasons I think this was happening is that a lot of what we were seeing was related to delays. People eventually master motor skills. It might be that it took them longer, and during that window while they were developing them, we could observe abnormalities. But eventually, people do learn, mostly learn to walk, talk, and etc. And so once we get towards the end of like the normative window of motor development, especially for gross motor behavior, it's much more difficult to rely on these kinds of assessments. Um, However, we know in adulthood uh, that there are many characteristic motor abnormalities in schizophrenia. And so my initial foray into this field involved looking at adolescents. I was particularly curious if I could test an idea that relates to a developmental concept called heterotypic continuity. And that's the idea that we know that this vulnerability is there from the time of birth, if not earlier. And at the same time, it becomes more difficult to assess so that the phenotypic expression of the vulnerability changes. But it doesn't mean that the mechanism of interest or the vulnerability of interest isn't there. And so my theory was that in adolescence, when we start to see the emergence of these kinds of symptoms, and there's much more interaction with the vulnerability, and it's much more active with environmental stressors and developmental factors, that we were going to see an emergence of motor abnormalities that was quite marked, particularly among those that would go on to convert to a disorder like schizophrenia. And so I launched forward with a few studies. I'm going to talk to you about two of those today. Um, the first one that I'm going to talk to you about involves a postural control experiment. And this really allows us to get to the idea of heterotypic continuity. On the left figure, you can see the clumsiness we saw in the video. And on the right is a picture, an illustration of a balance scale. This is a highly sensitive scale that was popularized by Bill Hetrick's team over at Bloomington. And it can pick up subtle deviations in posture through parametrizing sway area. I'll show you an example here. It looks really boring and kind of basic, but it's a very sensitive piece of equipment that requires a lot of care. It can pick up on the most minute movements. Um, here's an example of someone standing, and I'll show you the sway area data. It'll come up in the video. So tiny little rocking movements start to get graphed as a sway area. So we're interested in posture in particular because it taps into cerebellar thalamocortical function. The cerebellum plays a critical role in coordination and precision and accurate timing, and posture is heavily reliant on the system. It involves taking incoming sensory information and really using it to update internal models that are keeping us standing up. And then really refining them based on incoming sensory information. The more information the system has, the easier it is to build a model and stand up, the more difficult. So there's a really interesting paradigm where you can rob people of proprioceptive information by having them close their eyes or put their feet close together or various combinations of those kinds of things. And even in normative samples, you'll see a wider sway area when more sensory information is taken away. In this study, we recruited a group of clinical high-risk participants and controls and had them do four conditions: eyes open, feet apart; eyes closed, feet apart; eyes open. Uh, I'm sorry. Eyes closed, closed based; eyes closed, open based; eyes open, closed base; and eyes open, open base. Where when your feet are closest together and your eyes are closed, then it's the most difficult. And when your eyes are open and your feet are far apart, it's easiest. And we had them stand on the sway for a few minutes, and we mapped their sway area. And there were significant differences such that the clinical high risk group showed a wider sway area. We didn't see an interaction. So there wasn't a dose dependent response to difficulty, but across each of the conditions, the sway area was much larger. And this was a well-controlled study. We looked at alcohol use and cannabis and nicotine and age and other things that might have influenced the findings. But yeah, so we clearly picked up on this same kind of vulnerability you would see when someone is learning to walk and they're clumsy. It's easy to see, but it kind of goes away after they practice walking for a few years. But now we're picking up on that vulnerability again with sensitive equipment that's getting at the same underlying vulnerability. Notably, there were significant correlations between a wide sway area and increased negative symptoms. And this was really exciting. One of my favorite models of negative symptoms in schizophrenia, negative symptoms involve issues with volition and hedonic processes. But one of my favorite theories is the cognitive dysmetria theory, which posits that um, a lower level of tonic output from the cerebellothalamic complex results in a bottleneck that slows this sensory processing and leads to a variety of these kinds of issues. So, and there have been very few biomarkers predicting negative symptoms. It's something we've replicated now in a few samples, and it's a great example of how looking at motor behavior can really give us a tool that will allow us to get at vulnerabilities across developmental stages, or especially later developmental stages. I do the same kind of approach with several other motor behaviors, and I'll show you an example of one in a moment. This is a figure here depicting trying to model a striatal circuit dysfunction through a particular motor behavior. The same dysfunction, but with different behaviors across developmental stages. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a later question. Another issue that is facing the study and treatment and assessment, identification of serious mental illness is the need to distinguish between vulnerability and disease driving mechanisms. This is a real challenge. The field has relied heavily on endophenotypes and used these for biomarkers for the last 30, 40 years. And they are really great for picking up a higher liability for a disorder like schizophrenia. But they're not great for all purposes. And I'll give you some examples in a moment. So hyper and hypokinetic movements are a marker of frontal striatal dopamine dysfunction. Frontal subcortical circuits play an important role in broader things like action selection and execution networks, and they're really chiefly involved with filtering, focusing, and scaling vast amounts of information from and then to specialized cortical areas. Within the system, the basal ganglia normally exert constant inhibitory influence on the thalamocortical neurons that give rise to motor behavior. To initiate a movement, essentially what happens is the brakes are removed and then put back on very carefully in a scaling that takes place. At a functional level, the system serves to prevent movement from executing at inappropriate times and allowing intended movements to flow at other times. And in healthy conditions, this is balanced by dopamine. There's a delicate and coordinated balance of direct and indirect basal ganglia motor pathways. When dopamine is introduced into the circuit, the balance basically will involve near simultaneous interaction between this direct and indirect motor pathway, putting on and taking off the brakes. And in a disorder like Parkinson's, where the indirect pathway becomes more heavily balanced, we see too much inhibitory control from the basal ganglia. And intended movements are not getting through, and that leads to things like slowing. In disorders like Huntington's, we see the opposite. The direct pathway has dominance, and there's impulsivity and hyperkinetic movements, jerking, sudden unintended movements. What's really notable is that this series of motor symptoms occurring along a dimension scales with the dopamine dimension. In cases where Parkinson's people are over-medicated, we start to see psychotic symptoms or hyperkinetic movements. And similarly, in patients with Huntington's or in schizophrenia, where they're overtreated, we see the emergence of Parkinsonisms. So this is a really interesting and important movement because it ties into emerging dopamine dysfunction, which is of great interest to psychosis. So I thought about studying dyskinetic movements using a neurological rating scale, which we applied to clinical interviews. When we recruited 40 high-risk participants and followed them for 2 years, 25% of them developed a disorder like schizophrenia. And the level of movement abnormalities, the dyskinesias in that group were significantly higher for the face and upper body. And if high-risk youth, again, phenotypically similar to one another, came in and they happened to show one of these movements, the odds of them developing schizophrenia were 3 times higher, roughly, compared to those that didn't. In a follow-up study, and this really reifies the point I was making about tapping into mechanism, we found that the associations with positive symptoms, which are dopaminergic symptoms, increased every year that people progressed through this prodromal stage. So this is a great example of how attention to distinct movements can help tease apart this underlying vulnerability from later disease-driving mechanistically sensitive factors. Another issue that we face is that it's challenging to get at mechanistically relevant biomarkers in real-world settings. So this is something we come up against every day. We have expensive and delicate equipment that requires a lot of training. We have intensive interviews. It's really difficult to scale these things to a burdened health system, as I'm sure you all know. Motor behavior can also provide a real solution here. Speech is really wonderful for motor study. In this 10-second clip of speech, we see 13 lip closures, 22 tongue movements, and the larynx is vibrating 80 to 250 times per second. So it feels effortless to us, but we know that it's a complex and coordinated dance between a variety of cognitive, motor, and language systems. So motor coordination is something that you can study by analyzing the features of someone's voice. This has been popularized by looking at hypokinetic dysarthria in Parkinson's, where looking at a characteristic voice pattern can predict the disease or even be employed in precision medicine efforts. And we were interested in seeing if we could look at vocal features in this high-risk population. We developed a new computational tool and had participants quickly repeat pataka, pataka, pataka in a number of trials. And what we found was that the clinical high-risk participants showed a marked abnormality compared to controls in vocal features. So we looked at the duration of the initial consonant, which is calculated by parameterizing the voice onset time, a delay between releasing the initial consonant constriction and the start of the vowel. And this basically, an abnormality here, increased variability shows poor motor coordination. We wanted to validate that idea, so we took traditional motor assessments that are done in the lab, in this case, finger tapping, and we found slower finger tapping was tied to the slower rate of speech in this same study. And so it's a clear sign that there's promise here. Looking at the voice is a potent biomarker that's very easy to assess and to use AI tools to analyze. So deficits in motor control represent a viable mechanistic signal in real-world settings and have good potential for translational applications. I'm currently wrapping up an R01 study doing the same thing in depression, where we're looking at voice onset time and also other readily translatable markers that tap into the same kinds of motor functions that we've been discussing today. In this study, we're looking at keystroke variability on the iPhone and on the Android before and after depression episodes for a 2-year period in a group of people to get at markers of agitation and slowing. And we've had some great success so far, some great papers that come from that. So we're really excited about the approach. Similarly, we are finding a unique profile of vocal features in that group as well that will predict remission as well as relapse. Novel treatments are sorely needed. So I don't need to drone on too much about this. I think you're all aware the field needs new treatments for disorders across the board, but in my opinion, schizophrenia is high up there. And understanding and interacting with motor is a great way to influence brain function. I'll give you an example here. So we've already talked a little bit about the cerebellum, and I'm going to return there now. Motor learning is something I've always been really interested in. It's something we take for granted. It allows us to automate a variety of complex functions to free up working memory store and help us get through the day. It's also an area where, when deficits occur, you see market-related disability. For example, if you had to stop and think about tying your shoes every time you did it, that would slow you down. And imagine having to do that all the time with a variety of motor complex behaviors. It becomes a major influence on functional disability. Motor learning involves the cerebellum, and a similar process to posture. The cerebellum is playing a feedback role and using rapid online detection of sensory errors and comparing predicted movement with income errors. But it also has a feed forward mechanism because it uses this information to update internal models so that movement becomes more efficient over time. There are functionally unique and distinct areas of the cerebellum that, through connections through the thalamus and to the cortex, govern a range of motor and cognitive functions. A lot of work that's been done in basic cognitive neuroscience suggests that superior posterior areas like CRUS1, as indicated in the red here, are involved with more cognitive and learning processes, whereas anterior cerebellum and the vermis are more involved with motor precision and control. In this study, we looked at a uh, atlas of the cerebellum in these clinical high risk and healthy control teen participants that were matched to the group. And we used a motor learning paradigm that I'm very fond of that's called pursuit rotor. This is a paradigm that has a long and storied history. And when I first started in my lab in 2010, I thought I was going to have to go to Radio Shack and build one of these things. I was all set. They used a record player and a magnet, and it was a whole thing. I was downloading schematics from the internet, and but fortunately they computerized it right around that time, so I got to avoid electrocuting myself. And basically, it's a really simple task. You trace a mouse or around, trying to keep it on a red target as it moves around a track, and the assessor will titrate everyone. So by changing the speed of the ball, they'll all be starting at about 80% of the time on track. And then we have them do it 3 times. We wait 15 minutes, we repeat, and we do this 4 times over the period of an hour. And The idea is through motor learning, they get better and better and better and spend more time on target. And so it's a really simple, eloquent task that I use a lot. And what we wanted to see here was A, are there abnormalities in the cerebellar substructures in this clinical high risk group? And there certainly were compared to matched teen controls. But did these developmental abnormalities map onto motor behaviors? So we found a reduced rate in learning between the 15 and 30-minute mark on this task in this population. And we found that it was directly related to the cognitive area volume of the cerebellum. Notably, time on target was related to the motor area of the cerebellum, which really replicated some nice work coming out of the cognitive literature. So this gave us a basis for understanding that the procedural learning or motor learning deficits we were seeing in this high-risk population were at least in part related to cerebellar abnormalities. And so from there, we were curious if there was something we could do about it. The cerebellum is very accessible for even um, the most basic brain stimulation paradigms. And in this study, we were interested to see if we could access the cerebellar deficit by using TDCS, which is not directly evoking action potentials, but changing the likelihood that they'll evoke by raising or lowering the resting membrane potential. So in this study, we engaged the cerebellum in 25 minutes of active brain stimulation through a nodal direct current. And one of the nice things about this paradigm is it has a built-in sham condition. The participant doesn't know if they're getting a sham kind of tingle or the active tingle. And so we have them come in 1 week and then come back a couple of weeks later, and we do a double-blind crossover. So they don't know and we don't know. The machine keeps track of it. For purposes of illustration, I moved all of the sham here to the left figure. And this replicates what we saw in the clinical high-risk sample. In this study, we used an analog population. These were community controls that were showing high levels of psychosis symptoms, but not a lot of clinical issues. I like to do that when I start treatment studies. But it replicated well. There's a deficit in motor learning. It's fairly distinct. But after stimulation, the deficit remediates. And that's very, very exciting because, as I mentioned, motor learning contributes to a lot of disability in the prodrome and in schizophrenia. So this speaks to promise of studying motor-related behaviors in a treatment context. We're just wrapping up another TDCS study based on this study in first episode schizophrenia with a BBRF grant and getting ready to publish another positive set of findings. Now I'd like to turn to the last section of the talk today, another issue that we're all facing, and that's that it's difficult to make meaningful translation between experimental paradigms in the lab and broader domains of disability. We have great work linking basic behaviors and biomarkers and symptoms in the lab, and we have some secondary work with things like EMA or clinically rated symptoms in the last month, et cetera. But once you get into, how does this biomarker directly tie to this type of functional issue? There's a real lack there of research that's compelling or well replicated. And I think motor behavior fills in a missing part of the puzzle here in a big way. Social motor behaviors are absolutely fascinating. I've always been very interested in gesture behavior in particular. Gesture function and the brain circuits and areas that underlie normative gesture function are highly impacted in schizophrenia as well. Things involved in gesture perception involve the inferior parietal lobule, inferior frontal gyrus, and gesture performance. You see action planning sequences that pull on some of the same regions I mentioned, as well as the superior parietal lobule. In execution, you see motor one, supplemental motor area. When you see social relevant gestures, other areas involved with mentalization, such as the OFCer and superior frontal gyrus, are involved. When people are interpreting gestures, much more is involved. It's complex, but you see language and motor areas, like temporal pole, medial temporal gyrus. So all of these areas are of great interest to schizophrenia. And gesture behavior is fundamental for communicating. I'm particularly interested in the gestures that occur while we're speaking. I always leave this to the last part of the talk because people stare at my hands the rest of the time after I talk about it, and it makes me a little uncomfortable. But while we're talking, even if we don't realize it, we're doing a variety of motor behaviors that convey speech or accentuate speech or make our points or coincide with our points. There have been a variety of studies that suggest when we sit on our hands, we stutter. When people aren't allowed to gesture, the listener doesn't remember the story as well. There's a famous study in Nature where raters couldn't tell the difference between congenitally blind participants and sighted participants when they were telling a story. So it's integrally tied to the way that we've developed language and the way we think, and it's much one piece of an integrative process. All of these gestures tap into different brain functions and are important and critical for conveying semantic information. Notably, they also are uniquely impaired in youth that are at risk for psychosis. In this study, which was one of my first publications, we compared teens that were showing a high-risk syndrome, in this case, schizotypal personality disorder at ages 14 to 18. This was before the prodromal syndrome was established, and so we used to study this risk group by following teens that passed through schizotypal personality disorder. But in any case, we compared them with controls and other personality disorders and found gesture frequencies, particularly while they were talking, was much, much lower, but overall levels of movement was higher. Gesture and speech and cognition line up, but when they don't, you see a real disruption in the conveyance of semantic material. This is normative in young children that are learning advanced concepts. Teachers actually know to look for it because it means they're on the precipice of a big leap. But we see it in clinical high-risk youth that are well beyond these developmental stages, and that speaks to dysfunction. It really is a conversation stopper. They happen a lot more in the clinical high-risk participants, as you can see here. But being on the receiver side is also pretty interesting. I wanted to demonstrate what that was like for conversation partners, which is something I've become very interested in. So I launched a study where I had an actor deliberately engage in gesture speech mismatches. And I'm just going to play a short clip for you here. Please pay attention and let me know how you feel when you see these after a while.
This past weekend was very special because my little nephew had a birthday. Because he was turning 7, we wanted to make it an incredible event. When my mother and I had originally asked him what he wanted, he said a big chocolate cake. He also said that he wanted to invite 4 friends over and a magician. My mom agreed to make the invitations for his 4 friends and to call and
It gets really frustrating, right? It's quite disruptive. And right now we're studying error-related negativity in conjunction with perceiving those kinds of gestures. Because what we're finding is when these individuals don't participate in normative speech patterns or social cognitive behavior patterns, it influences the perception of the partner or people around them. And that, from what we know, can influence the participant further and create a cascade. And we're seeing that exact same kind of thing in a study I'll talk about at the very end. Gesture perception is also disrupted in high-risk youth individuals. In this eye tracking study where they watched the same actor do a story that with congruent gestures, this one wasn't mismatched. They paid the same amount of attention as controls to literal gestures, but looked less frequently at abstract gestures. So there are a variety of dysfunctional behaviors that are directly contributing to the broad social dysfunction that's characteristic of this population. This population is in a developmental period where they're learning skills challenging social skills, first relationships, first jobs, getting into college, finishing high school. They're going to set the stage for a lifetime, and they're becoming increasingly disrupted. And so it's a really important period for intervention. This is a collaboration with Steve as well. We recently observed that head movement, so pro-social gestures like head nodding, are happen more slowly compared to all other head movements in the high risk group compared to controls. Also taken from naturalistic videos using AI methods. Um, and we have good evidence here that this is relevant to symptomatology because it seems to be tied uniquely to disorganized speech, which is a symptom that's rated by assessors, indicating the person has trouble conveying information, but not related to anything else, like positive symptoms or negative symptoms, etc. Um, and the last study I'll talk about, which is one that's just under review right now, we've also observed that interpersonal synchrony is disrupted in this group. So interpersonal synchrony is another one of those really subtle behaviors that plays a huge role in how effective a communication is. It's defined as the temporal alignment of movements between interacting partners, and it's a critical process for social interaction. In our study, we found that CHR participants showed significantly reduced strength of synchrony compared to controls. And really, what was so notable was the clinical correlates, again, related to social anhedonia, and the strength of the synchrony between the assessor and the participant was linked to better social and role functioning. Conversely, poor synchrony to worse social and role functioning. But most notably in this study, which is something we're following up now in another study, the assessors began to mirror and mimic the participants. So the assessors started to change their behaviors as the interviews progressed, and synchrony became increasingly disrupted. So there's a potential for a cascade here, and it's really consistent with interpersonal theories of depression and how one's behavior influences their environment, which influences them in turn. Okay, I'd like to just close now by summarizing that motor signs can be really useful in a variety of contexts, and that this is an area that needs a lot more work. The lab is currently doing more foundational studies in the scanner. We develop all sorts of equipment. Here we put an air bladder in a grip strength force transducer paradigm. And in addition to that, we're doing transdiagnostic studies. We're really interested in improving and gamifying a lot of our assessments. This is a study we're doing on autism right now with a Mario Kart type haptic paradigm where we get a proprioception and visual delay. In addition to that, we're trying to redo the home movie study I showed you in the first couple slides that my mentor had done, but also looking at language and emotion across early periods in the premorbid stage. And finally, we're really interested in engaging the brain with movement, and we've been doing a lot of exercise remediations, targeting the hippocampus in particular and stress function. So there's a lot more to be done here, but it's a very fruitful area, and I hope it's one that has piqued your interest today. I'd like to close by thanking my collaborators who play a huge role in all of this work. And now I'll open it for questions.
All right, thank you, Vijay. That was excellent. And we don't have too much time for questions, but we have about 3 minutes or so. So we have a question that's come across from a remote viewer, which is there evidence to suggest that early intervention with physical therapy or occupational therapy with children at high risk for developing schizophrenia with these motor symptoms have better outcomes, either treatment or decreased symptom burden?
Oh, that's a great question. Those studies haven't been done. It's so sad, but they haven't. I think at these early stages, the field is really contending with the idea that the signal might be too diffuse. And then right now, NIH is putting all of its money into this prodromal stage right before onset. But I'm arguing that the field needs to move much earlier and that we can be predictive from early behaviors, but previous till now, we've only been using these retrospective movie designs, and there hasn't been much work since then. And we have so many better tools now, and we can look at a variety of complex behaviors we couldn't before. And those original studies that I showed didn't even have sound. And the granulation of the video wasn't good. I think if we go earlier and earlier, those kinds of studies can make a huge difference, occupational therapy and many more things. They're also consistent with clinical staging treatment models where even if it doesn't help everyone, that only the people that needed it, it can't hurt anybody, and it's cheap, and so it's a good thing to do at a large level. So Pat McGorry and Barnaby Nelson are big proponents of that in Australia, and it's catching on in other countries as well, although I'm afraid not in the US yet.
Okay. Well, we have one more, I think, time for one more question, and we actually have one more question. So this is, first, really great talk, Vijay. Thanks. This is from Judy. Given the role of sensory motor signals in helping form the sense of bodily self, are there findings suggesting links between motor dysfunction and self-disturbance in schizophrenia, such as passivity experiences, sensed presence, and similar things?
Yes, absolutely. I am particularly fond of Sohee Park's work and Katie Thacker's work in this area. Anomalous experience, sense of body space, body temperature, placing where the emotion is in the body are all tied to motor abnormalities as well. And it's a really exciting area. We've been sharing trainees and sending them to one another for the last few years with hopes that we can do more complex and experimental work in this area. But I think it's definitely where the future is.
Okay. All right. So thanks again. We should stop now. And Vijay, that was really interesting. And hopefully we can get you back here sometime in the future.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a delight. And I'm coordinating with the staff there to set up a time to meet with trainees in the coming weeks. So there'll be an opportunity to chat more about this too.
Okay. Right. So for all you residents and psychology interns, you still have more time to be thinking of questions.
Otherwise, I'll ask you questions.
Okay. All right, Vijay, have a good day. And to everybody here, thanks for coming, and see you next time.